Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Michael, for that lovely introduction. Now it's my turn to make an introduction of our special guest, Sara Nelson. Sara is president of the Association of Flight Attendants, which is affiliated with CWA, the Communication Workers of America. I just want to, for those of you who don't already know this, give you a little background on who she is. Sara became a flight attendant back in 1996, and shortly after that became active in her union and worked her way up the ranks. So she's a rank and file activist who is now the president of her union. She was elected to that position in 2014. People inside the labor movement have had their eye on her for quite some time, but she sort of catapulted into rock star status in early 2019, not that long ago, though it seems an age, given everything that's happened since. You may recall the federal government shut down under Trump in late 2018 and it continued into the new year, 2019. And about a month in, Sara Nelson issued a public call for a general strike to challenge the legitimacy of the shutdown. So that I think has made, is when people in the wider world began paying attention. But like I said, she was kind of a rock star inside labor for some time before that. She's been very outspoken on other issues as well, including sexual assault, sexual harassment. She also mobilized an effort last spring to free a flight attendant with DACA status who had been incarcerated by ICE at a detention center. This May, she became the co-chair of the Economy Task Force in the Sanders-Biden unity platform effort for the Democratic Party. And finally, as many of you may already be aware, a lot of people in the labor movement are promoting the idea of her becoming the next president of the AFLCIO when President Richard Trumka's term expires next year. So that's just a little background. I could have gone on longer, but I think that's more than enough given how little time we have. We are so honored to have Sara join us today for this discussion of COVID capitalism, as well as the various, the multiple crises the country is facing at this point. As Michael said before, if you have questions that occur to you in the course of our conversation, please enter them in the Q&A on Zoom and we'll get to you. I'm going to start with a few questions myself to get us going. So first, Sara, in the early days of the pandemic last spring, which, seems like ancient history, but it's really only 6 or so months ago, many workers, both union workers and non-union workers, took action on their own to challenge the conditions they were facing in the workplace, or in some cases, they're being laid off and unemployed. Those still working, so-called essential workers, demanded health and safety protections so that they could work, pay leave if they became infected, and so on. And some of those issues were addressed, others not so much. In your industry, the airline industry, the big issue was the potential for layoffs or furloughs as travel collapsed. So tell us a little bit about your union's strategy to address the pandemic at that stage and what you won.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Ruth. And it's super exciting to be here with everyone today. I want to thank CUNY, Labor and Urban Studies. Michael, thank you for kicking us off. And just really great to be talking with everyone here today. I should just note that over my shoulder here is Paul Frischkorn. He stays there. He was the first flight attendant to die of COVID in March, and from contracting that on the job. And he stays here as a reminder. He was a good union activist, and even the week before, he was talking with flight attendants about their benefits and their options, explaining unemployment, explaining their retirement benefits, working to the last day as a union rep. And so he stays here to keep us going because we can't stop. So we were actually on the front lines of coronavirus from the very beginning, from late December. And Ruth, one of the first things that we did was interface with our airlines on making sure that not only were we enforcing contractual rights to sick leave and the ability to use that, but also to have the corporations actually be more generous in those sick leave rights and protecting people and protecting people who needed to go onto quarantine and all of those things, so that we could be making good, safe decisions and not encouraging people to come to work sick. So we got to work on all of those things right away. But then in March, all of a sudden there was this cliff drop off when coronavirus hit community spread in the United States. And we've seen crisis before. And so we knew what was going to happen if the airline industry was suddenly in trouble, not able to have passenger demand, and that would be put on labor's backs if we didn't get busy fast. And so we put together a plan when demand dropped down to just 3% of what it had been the year before. The safety issues actually all of a sudden for a little while there were not such a huge issue because our planes were empty and we were not really interfacing with people. But what we got to work on March 13th, we got to Chairman DeFazio of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, a plan that is the first people's bailout ever. And so what it did was it made sure that any money that would go to the airlines was a jobs and infrastructure plan only, a workers first program. So it could only go to be paying a worker's pay and benefits, keeping us in our jobs, connected to our healthcare, and that they would also have to take a cap on executive compensation well after that funding is expired, a ban on stock buybacks and dividends. We actually worked to try to get some other things in this package, like union neutrality in organizing, the biggest thing they fought against, by the way, because they don't want to have sustained ability for workers to stand up for themselves. But what was great about going to Chairman DeFazio, who's really been a champion for workers his entire career in Congress, several decades now, was that he said to the airlines, I'm not going to work with you unless you work with labor first. And so he said, call Sara Nielsen. And I said, listen, the people don't like you. This is not going to work if you think you're going to go to Congress and just get money and you're going to decide how to use it. We are going to have to make this a workers first package. And we used that leverage right then to get them to agree to something that no other industry agreed to. And then we walked hand in hand with our industry. As I said, we tried to work on some additional things like the union neutrality, seats on the boards, things like that. But the trunk of what we put forward in a proposal to make this a workers first package and not a corporate bailout is what we ultimately got in the CARES Act. It's the most transparent. It has kept people in their jobs, kept people connected to their healthcare during a pandemic. And we have been working to extend that because that expired on September 30th. And now there's no prohibition on furloughs. We're still right in the middle of this crisis.
Hoping for a second package, I know, and we all are hoping for that. Okay, well yeah. So as you said, the airline industry workers did much better than, I can't think of any other case that's comparable. But there are really three groups, it seems to me. There's you, which are in the special categories you just explained. There are other unionized workers who also, tried to do some of the same things with mixed success. And then there are non-union workers who didn't have union protection at all and were kind of on their own. Could you just comment on how those three groups fared in the last few months as the pandemic unfolded? And how, what the variations were and why?
Well, first of all, we are 80% organized in the airline industry. That made all the difference here because we actually were able to bring the power of labor and the power of capital to this discussion. The people heading up these mega corporations, we were actually working together on this package. And that's only because of our power in the airline industry. So clearly that made a difference in saving our jobs, having those protections and having this first ever people's bailout workers first package in relief, even in the middle of this political climate. So that was really important. But then in addition to that, we also forced our airlines to do things that the government would not. So this administration has made wearing masks a political issue rather than a public health issue, has lied to people, not given people the real information about the virus. And because we were so organized and have such a huge seat at the table on safety and health issues going back decades, we were able to really force our airlines to put policies in place that the government refused to mandate. The government refused to coordinate for the industry. So within 7 days' time, we forced them to put mask policies in place, a mask mandate. We forced them to improve cleaning and the air filtration. We made them work with us on service procedures so that we're cutting down on the amount of contact that we have with passengers. And we made them work with us on some waivers so that flight attendants have some space. It's impossible to socially distance on an airplane, but while we are in our jump seats, we made sure that we worked with them so that we didn't have passengers directly within 6 feet of us. Things like this. So we did a lot of work, and we were able to do that because we're already there, we're well established. And even in our contracts, we have safety sections in our contracts that require these airlines to work with us on safety issues. So that was really important, and it was transparent. It's reported on the evening news. Everybody knows what's going on, and we really have a partnership there. And it creates a partnership. In other areas where workers did not have as much of a voice, what happened in some cases was with the relief bill, they would put forward a set of labor issues that they wanted included in the relief bill, as opposed to presenting the trunk of the relief bill and the basis for what it is. So it was a list of things to, try to improve the relief bill and have a worker section of the relief bill almost off to the side. And then the workers who have no representation at all, some of them we've seen at McDonald's, at Amazon, they've taken action on their own and made a difference in those individual acts, many times withholding their labor, and made a difference on a case-by-case basis, but there's nothing sustaining there. And it's very difficult to tell those stories there because the companies can retaliate, fire people, do all of those things. So that keeps workers' voices silent. And of course, we saw some of the worst of that in the meatpacking industries. And so without a union, your safety and health is really about the bottom line and not about anybody's health. You're expendable. You can be called an essential worker, being given a big title that you're supposed to pay your bills with on that. But there's no return, and there's no real reality of that respect in the workplace, respect for your life, respect for your work, either with those safety protections or those protections for your job.
Right. Well, meatpacking is a very important example, although it is actually somewhat unionized, so that's a more complicated story.
It is.
We did here in the labor school, we did an analysis as part of our annual report on unions of what happened in terms of layoffs and deaths and infections among New York City's workers for a number of unions. And one thing we saw quite quickly was that non-union workers were much more likely to become infected, to die, than non-union workers for the reasons that you already suggested. And then, so from a labor perspective, what were the limitations of the emergency legislation that was passed in the spring, and what do you see as the priorities for this next round, if there is one? Well, there will be one someday, I suppose, but possibly before the election.
Well, there has to be one before the election because, as we know, and this is no surprise, there's reporting in the Washington Post today, but no one should be surprised by this. Republicans are planning to switch to austerity after the election and refuse to do anything. So now is the time to get relief in place. We need to get as much relief locked in as possible. We also there are people out there struggling. There's a New York Times story today saying 8 million people have fallen into poverty during the time of coronavirus. So we got to work to get this done right now. And the political pundits would say nothing's going to happen. What I would say is that we have moved mountains on keeping this story in the press, even with everything else that is going on. It is very much the top item in the press. Last night, Shepard Smith did an hour-long documentary on just the airline industry alone and the ripple effect there. So the cab drivers who go to the airport and how that has affected them. The parking attendants and all the communities around aviation. And so there is this ripple effect when you don't prop up these jobs, more and more people get hurt. The $600 checks, those checks were propping up another 5 million jobs because people were spending back into the economy. So if we don't do relief right now, we are going to be in a position in February. Oh, that's a long time away. By the way, a lot of people are going to die, not only from coronavirus, but from poverty. And let's just be really clear about that. So this is about people's lives, and between now and then. And in February, depending upon what the outcome of this election is, let's just say that Biden wins the election and is able to take office, and we have a new Congress that is all Democrats, or maybe not. They are going to have to try to do this without the Republicans. And that is going to be very hard. And it's going to be a much bigger package. And there is going to be all this pressure not to do as much as is needed to be done. So we need people right now to get the relief that they can. What we have done with our packages, we've actually gotten incredible bipartisan support for continuing our payroll support program to keep airline workers in our jobs. And it just, we can't seem to get it into a final bill, but we're fighting for ourselves. Half my union is on furlough right now, involuntary furlough, not getting a paycheck, and disconnected from their health care in the middle of this pandemic after serving as essential workers on the front lines. And we need to get them restored to their jobs. But we also want to make sure that we are not adding to the problem. What we said from the very beginning is that when you face a crisis, you need to make sure that you have as many people strong and able to take care of themselves as possible so that we can focus on the sick and vulnerable and target our support there. And if there's fewer of us who are able to take care of ourselves, it's much harder to do. So we've got to try to encourage these parties to lock this in, and no relief is just not an option. We are continuing to protest at congressional offices across the country. There's protests going on today with flight attendants, and we're going to keep pushing. And I encourage people to watch the CNBC Shepard Smith documentary from last night, because it really does a good job of showing how we are all connected in work and how we've got to do everything we can to keep, as I said, as many people strong as possible so that we're able to help those who are really in need.
Thank you. So as you know, as we all know, the election is less than 3 weeks away now. And we have a president who has already publicly stated that he may not accept the results of the election, which right now look like a defeat for him. If that were to occur, we will have a very different kind of crisis on top of the existing economic and health crises that we're already in the middle of, not to mention the racial justice crisis that's ongoing as well. What role could and should the labor movement play if that happens, if Trump refuses to step down?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, labor has got to be ready to act, and labor has got to be ready to mobilize in a series of strikes, or leading a general strike, or whatever that is. We have the ability and the power to make that change. We know that from what happened a year ago with the government shutdown. Just uttering the words that we should talk about a general strike, and a few flights stopping in LaGuardia. Our union, of course, in addition to saying we should talk about a general strike, we were also talking about a safety strike for flight attendants, because it was getting less and less safe at work. And just a few flights, within a few hours, we suddenly had a deal. And that wasn't just so much about stopping the economy. It was about the people in charge not wanting labor to taste our power. Because if that had gone on and people had really understood the power that we have by withholding our labor, we would be in a much better position right now, actually, to take up the question that you're asking. So I do want to just go back too, and I think that this president knows very well the power that we have and the ability that we have to stand up for our country and for our democracy. And that is why a week ago, he called off talks suddenly, said there's going to be no relief talks any further, and then 6 hours later called out airline workers only and said he just wanted to do a bill for us. I want to be really clear. The president has no interest in helping union workers. And so what that was the typical divide and conquer tactic of a union buster. And what we need to recognize is that that was a union buster in chief talking, and really trying to isolate the one industry that is 80% organized in the private sector and also has tremendous power in the sort of scenario that you're talking about. So part of our efforts to get this relief locked in is also to make sure that we are strong and able to stand with the rest of labor for what's necessary to secure our democracy. And there are a lot of discussions happening behind the scenes on that, and I think people can plug into those. But we have to be ready, and we have to make sure we're as strong as possible going into these fights that are very likely to come.
The power of a strike is somewhat reduced now compared to January 2019, of course, because so many people are not working in the first place, so that going on strike isn't very meaningful in that context. Are there other avenues you can see through which labor could flex its muscles in this situation? You know, if 90% of the planes are flying anyway, I mean, it would be bad if 100% weren't, obviously, but it's not the same as it was last year.
It's not. Although I want to make sure that we're not taking that off the table. But what I can also say is that just having labor organized and able to get people to act very quickly is very important. So we also, because we interface with our companies, I'll take us back a little over a year ago when the family separation policy became clear. We turned that policy around. Of course, that hasn't been completely rectified, but we turned that policy around in 48 hours because flight attendants said we were going to refuse to work any flights that facilitated that evil policy of family separations. And our airlines actually spoke up from that and said that they would not participate in that either, and the government could not use the airlines in order to facilitate that. So we can mobilize very quickly through our unions. We've been doing that also with these Relief Now events where we are doing pop-up protests, and we're able to have a very coordinated message targeted across the country for decision makers. We can bring people out together, have mass demonstrations, but we also really need to be very methodical about looking at where do we strategically have contracts that are expiring? Where can we actually flex that muscle in a series of strikes? We can do this in a way that is going to be very effective. And frankly, if the planes all stop, that is something that will grab everyone's attention, and suddenly there has to be action to fix that. And so I would caution people to think that we don't have the kind of power that we did before, because we do.
Okay. So in the past, prior to the triple or quadruple or whatever it is crises that we're in at the moment, going back to before last March, say, you participated in a bunch of discussions about the merits of labor putting energy into political efforts, getting Democrats elected and stuff like that on the one hand, and organizing on the other. Now, they're not mutually exclusive in my view anyway, but could you just comment on how you see what you think is the right balance between those two activities and priorities for organized labor?
Well, first of all, if labor is organizing and understanding that that is our first job, to bring more people to the labor movement, to show that this is a labor movement for everyone. This is not a club, but this is for all working people. We really have an opportunity right now through this shared experience of coronavirus to organize in the millions. We're never going to have a situation like this again, where the entire country is sharing some of the same things at the same time. And we've got a narrative there to bring people together and understand the value and the power of joining a union. So organizing has to be the top priority because elections come and go. And even when we elect people who are, who maybe are grounded in the values of the labor movement, we have to back up their ability to get anything done in the Congress or in whatever position they are holding, because the power is really from the electorate or from the people. And where else can we really engage people and flex that muscle but in our unions? The other reason it's so important to be organizing all the time, and I mean internal organizing and external organizing, is that the issues that we face right now seem to be stuck in a quagmire of polarization. And the one place where we do not have a self-selecting process is in our jobs. The boss decides who to hire. So it is a wide range of people with a wide range of beliefs. And when you have to take a strike vote, you have to get people to a place of understanding what's at stake, the urgency of it, and what they're willing to do to fight for it. And those common things, you can bring people together who otherwise think of themselves as very different on a political spectrum or on a past experience or cultural spectrum. And so our union halls, metaphorical or not, are where we need to have these tough discussions and bring people together and understand that if we are a part of the discussion on the front end, the climate crisis, we can turn this to our favor for working people. We can make a plan that actually improves our lives, improves our jobs, improves labor rights. But if we're not on the front end of this discussion and we wait for this crisis to get so bad that people are begging the government to act, that is going to be controlled by the capitalists, and the capitalists will win, and there will be more cuts to labor and more people will hurt in the process. So we have to make sure that the organizing is number one. Electing people to office and encouraging union members to run for office, sure, that's part of the process. But if we're not organizing, the politics don't work.
Thank you. So another issue that I'm so glad you mentioned the thing about that the boss controls hiring, because that's been true for a long, long time in most industries. And one result of that is that industries really vary in terms of who is hired and in terms of race, gender, and so on. And in regard to gender, first of all, it's often struck me that the labor movement in some ways is segmented into, just like the workforce is, into female-dominated and male-dominated segments. So for example, teachers are pretty overwhelmingly women, as are flight attendants, as are nurses, not 100%, but largely. The building trades, on the other hand, another still fairly unionized, not 80%, but in some cities, highly unionized sector is men, as are firefighters, for example. So what do you see as the best? I mean, in your industry, by bringing all those unions together in airlines, you've kind of bridged that gap, I think, pretty successfully. But what would it take to do that in the larger labor movement? And, you know, well, which is still led, despite what I just said, is still led overwhelmingly by men, white men, actually. That's begun to change. It's better than it was half a century ago, but we got a long way to go. So could you just comment on that, on those issues of, you know, gender within the labor movement and what the agenda should be there?
Yeah, so one of the first things that we have to do is take on racial and gender justice. That has to be at the forefront of our priorities as a labor movement. I like to tell this story about when the Me Too movement broke. And my union was formed in 1945 to deal with discriminatory issues. We fought to make sure that you didn't have to quit when you were 30, that you could be Black, that you could be brown, that you could be a man in my job, that you didn't have to step on a weight scale. We had to do that until 1993. We had fought through a ton of discriminatory practices and even changed our job title to try to break through that sexism. But the industry had never denounced it. We had always fought for ourselves and taken care of ourselves. And when the Me Too movement broke, it was suddenly this aha moment that we could actually demand of our airlines that they denounce that sexist past and actually hold us up as safety professionals. And if they were doing that and calling for zero tolerance of sexual harassment and assault in our workplace, the 62% of the flight attendants who responded to the survey who said that, yes, they experience physical and verbal sexual harassment on the plane, would be in a safer environment and also be in a better place to make sure that there is a response when a passenger has experienced a sexual assault on the plane. And previously, there were only 7% of those reported, and only half of those would say, would encourage people to actually report the next time because nothing was ever done. So we were calling on our airline management to speak up on this. And we were asking for stories through this polling and through just anecdotal stories. And we were not hearing from any men. And so I started to ask some of my male colleagues who I have seen be targets of sexual harassment on the job and objectification. And I said, why aren't you speaking up? And they said, to a T, they said, Sara, we work in a workforce that is 80% women. And so this is a moment for women's equality. And if we want to have bargaining power, we have to step back and make sure that this is a moment where women gain power at work and gain recognition at work. And that's the only way we're going to move forward. So that's the perspective of men in a largely women's dominated profession. And I think you can apply that anywhere else. You know, I'm wearing the Unite Here t-shirt, one job should be enough. And what Unite Here has done with this program is to say that all work has dignity. Every single job that you do. I had a CEO one time say to me, Sara, you can only pay so much to put lettuce on a plate. No, anyone who comes to work and is contributing to this economy deserves to have just one job to take care of their family, deserves to have respect at work. And if we don't start to tackle the ideas, the boss's tools of sexism and racism in the work to divide us, then we are never going to move forward as a labor movement. We're never going to garner our power. And so as we do that, we will also naturally start to get leaders who understand that this is a movement for them. We've done this within our own union. We've been very intentional recently about this because we had not necessarily been great on race before. And so we're very intentional about that. And our leadership in just a year's time has changed dramatically as we're working intentionally to address these issues and make sure that the members of our union know that this is a priority for us. So as we do that, we are going to build our power. We're going to bring more voices to the table. We're going to be better because we're going to have new ideas, and we're going to have people who have had to deal with being marginalized all their lives. And oftentimes I find they make incredible leaders because they lead without ego and oftentimes have to be very creative about how to get things done. So you have a lot of different options for solving problems. And so this is going to make us much stronger. But bottom line, we have to put racial and gender equality as the top priority for the labor movement.
So one more piece of that I don't think you mentioned is immigrant workers who have been, so 20 years ago, the AFLCIO did a kind of 180-degree turnaround and changed its official stance toward immigration from a more restrictionist agenda to one embracing the immigrant rights movement, and it's stayed there as, you know, in terms of the AFL-CIO and for the unions that have a lot of immigrant members ever since. But again, the labor movement is still somewhat divided on that issue. Do you have any ideas about how that could be successfully addressed within the House of Labor?
Yeah, we have to be unapologetic about taking on these issues. And the truth is that the labor movement was formed by immigrants. If you look 100 years ago at the United Mine Workers and the organizing that was going on in the coal fields, oftentimes the boss was purposefully hiring immigrants who spoke, in some cases, 28, 29 different languages, and hoping that workers, by not identifying with each other, being able to pit them against each other, because trying to call out their differences and keep them separated, and literally put people together who can't communicate with each other. What the bosses didn't realize is that when one human being shares that space and that working space, we have way more in common than anything that can divide us. And when you have to watch someone deal with the loss, mourn the loss of their husband or their father, that has an impact on all of us. And that shared experience is what built the United Mine Workers of America. And that is what seeded our labor movement. So this is our history. We have to talk about our history. We have to deal with that with pride, and we have to force this issue. And we can't just let Fox News do the talking to our members. If we're not having these discussions, if we're not taking on these issues and being intentional about that, then we are going to cede that power. But as long as we are not a movement that is taking on immigrants' rights, we are undercutting ourselves at every turn.
Yes. Well, so coming back to the pandemic situation, as you know, Black and brown workers have been much more likely to contract COVID and to lose their lives as a result. And many of them are so-called essential workers. Not all, but many of them are. Sometimes this is based on poverty or where people live, but it's also in the workplace in a big way. And so in the beginning of the crisis, we heard a lot about essential workers and, healthcare workers are our heroes, et cetera, et cetera. That seems to have faded more recently. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that and what could be done about getting us back to that space and making it not just a symbolic recognition, but something concrete for those workers.
Yeah. So corporations show their respect with money. We should just be aware of that. And it's really nice to give people a title, but if you don't back that up with actual recognition for that work, hazard pay, the grocery workers, none of us could have survived if they weren't going to work, and we got temporary bump in pay for them. We're still in the middle of this crisis. That should have been a permanent bump in pay, because we need to finally recognize that whether coronavirus is here or not, they're essential to our lives. We don't exist without the work that they're doing in those grocery stores, as one example. So we need to get back to talking about who is actually providing the value in the economy. And I think that has to be coupled with the willingness to talk about the strike. Because the strike is really what calls attention to the power that labor has and the respect that we are due. That doesn't mean that you just go on strike all the time. Sometimes sometimes you have to beat on management, and sometimes they just have to remember the beating they're going to take if they don't deal fairly with you. And so we have to keep that in our toolbox all the time and be preparing to strike all the time, because that will give attention to the real value that we bring. And so that's part of what we have to do. But we also have to really call this out and recognize that the boss hopes that you will move on. The boss knows that the vast majority of people who come to work and just want to do a good job and take pride in the work they do, they take advantage of that. And we do this over and over again. And I think about the government shutdown, and I think about the fact that even though the government was failing them, the people in the highest leadership positions were failing them, transportation security officers were still coming to work. They were sleeping in their cars sometimes because they didn't have money for gas to get home and back to the airport, so that they could continue to come to work and continue to keep our country going, even without getting a paycheck. So the boss knows that we will make it work every time. And if they can give us less and less, they'll keep pushing that until there's a breaking point. And there has been a lot of concern before coronavirus, actually, from Wall Street, that maybe they had pushed labor too far. I mean, we've got a wage crisis going on in this country, even just going into coronavirus. So now here we are in this crisis, and what that has done is it has triggered for people who are in a crisis. What can I do to help? Because that is what most people do. That is what is in the hearts of every worker, how they take care of their families and look out for other people and want to take pride in the job that they do. And so we have to have constant conversations about the value of that work and hold each other up and help each other understand why we have to stand together to demand that the capitalists recognize our contributions to the economy, and that it just simply would not go on if it were not for us.
Okay, we just have about 5 more minutes of my questions, and I just want to remind the audience, and then we're going to turn to some of you have inserted questions in the Zoom function, so we'll get to those very soon. I just want to ask Sarah one more question, which is more sort of thinking about the future, and hopefully we do have a Biden administration in 2021. I know we can't count on that, but let's be optimistic for a moment and think about what that would look like. And if that were to occur, what do you see as the priorities that the labor movement should be promoting to that administration? You know, many of us worry that the Biden administration will be a rerun of the Clinton administration or something in terms of taking a very corporate approach to both economic issues and the rest, or with Obama, even when AFLCIO failed, despite the hopes that people had when he was first elected. What can we do to make sure that doesn't happen again?
Well, first of all, I do have on my bookshelf here Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. And this is required reading for everyone watching this program right now. We need to understand that this is the public's money, that the federal government can invest in people, can invest in infrastructure. Right now, we need an investment in people so that we are not thrust into a depression here. So we need to encourage the Biden administration to not be constrained by the deficit hawks who really use the deficit as a means to divide people and confuse people. Because all that you have to look out for is making sure that there is not an inflation that is out of control. But otherwise, the federal government can invest in the people and fill the real deficit holes of good jobs, of housing, of education, of healthcare. And so I can pivot from that and say, this is what we have to be pushing Biden on. He needs to follow through with an infrastructure plan that is a green infrastructure plan that can create millions of good jobs and be a part of creating millions of units of housing so that we make sure that we do not have homeless in the in the richest country in the earth. And so that we are also investing in education and giving everyone a chance to get that education. And I think the glaring issue here, of course, in the middle of this pandemic is healthcare. So connecting healthcare to people's jobs is cruel and it doesn't work. And as a union organizer and negotiator, I know that every single time that we go to the bargaining table, we have to fight like hell to hang on to the healthcare that we negotiated decades ago. And it doesn't get any better because the costs go up and up. In a for-profit system, you are making lives a commodity. And that's just not right. We need to address this as healthcare as a human right. And I think there's a real opportunity in the midst of this pandemic and this crisis for us to push harder on that. We know where Biden has stood in wanting to protect and expand the ACA and try to get more people healthcare. That's going in the better direction than Trump is going in trying to tear it all down, of course. But it's not really right until we secure healthcare as right. And when I go to Canada and talk with my union sisters and brothers in Canada and talk with them about the fact that 3/4 of our time is at the bargaining table is spent on negotiating over healthcare, on trying to keep those costs from rising for our members and eking away any wages that we can increase. And the time that we bargain, we're losing out on those wage increases that we would otherwise be getting, they shake their heads. They can't believe it. And they also can't believe that, especially in this moment, in this moment of shared experience for all of us, where we are recognizing that if one person doesn't have access to healthcare, the rest of us are at risk. Because as long as one person has the virus living in them, the rest of us are at risk. And so we've got to really push the Biden administration on this issue, and continue to push forward to make sure that we can secure healthcare as a human right.
And then what about labor law reform as part of that? And, you know, there's been a lot of talk lately in my circles anyway about trying to adopt the more European approach of sectoral bargaining, and which you kind of have in the airline industry a little bit, but most places don't. What are your thoughts about that set of priorities for a Biden administration?
Well, I think, you know, Biden has committed to the PRO Act, which would repeal right to work. It would repeal most of Taft-Hartley. It would give us the ability to have the secondary boycott, which is so critically important, especially as we have this contractor status going on, and a separated employment status where they try to have two-tiered or three-tiered employment structures, and you can't hold the decision makers accountable. That secondary boycott is going to be so critical in labor's ability to tackle the value of our work and make sure that we're lifting that up rather than moving to the lowest common denominator. So all of those provisions are very important. In terms of sectoral bargaining, that's not on the vice president's plan. You're right. So I love that you called out that we sort of have that in the airline industry. And that's because if you can actually organize and get unions to a higher density, you naturally create a sectoral bargaining, because now you are requiring the companies to compete to the highest standards. So those companies in the airline industry who are not unionized, sure, they pay their workers less, but they do it in tricky ways, and they pay their workers much more because they have to compete with the union contracts that are in place. So this creates a standard that keeps us moving forward when you do that organizing, and clearing the way and making it possible to do that organizing with the labor rights that Biden has endorsed are going to be key to allowing us to actually organize without those roadblocks in the way.
Okay, great. I'm going to switch now to questions from the audience. So there is one that's a perfect segue because it's related to what you were just talking about. And so this is from John Lawrence, who writes, the primary beneficiary of the CARES Act, that's the legislation last spring that Congress passed to offer some relief to people. But he says the primary beneficiary was banks and corporations. And there's a site in the chat if you're interested of that. The CARES Act gave $500 billion to the Fed, which leveraged that into about $5 trillion. What are labor's demands, he asks, regarding bank, monetary, and Fed policy? I know that's a big question, but.
No, that's great. That's a great question. So actually the program that we created, the Workers First package for the airlines, it was 1.25% of that $2 trillion CARES Act. And that $500 billion, you can actually look it up. There's a Fortune op-ed that I co-authored with Katie Porter to apply what we did with the airlines to that $500 billion. And so to create a program where companies can actually use that $500 billion only if they are agreeing to the principles that we created in the airline industry, which means that it has to go to workers paying benefits, keeping in their jobs and connected to their healthcare, and also with the other restrictions on those companies when they access that money. So there's no reason that we couldn't make those requirements of any companies that are accessing that money that was designated. And that is the template that we would hope would be in place, which is another reason that we're fighting so hard to keep this template in place, because it is the highest standard. And if this doesn't continue, what we are doing is we are casting out the best standard for working people and for any government funds, and then allowing them to drive us to the lowest standard, which is just bailing out the banks and giving the money to corporations and allowing them to do whatever they want with it, including awarding themselves. So that's not okay. We do have a standard that we think should be applied to the rest of the money.
Okay, great. Here's another question. This one is from Jack Hammond, my colleague actually in sociology at the Grad Center. He asks, air travel is a fossil fuel dependent industry. How does that affect your position on environmental issues, and especially the Green New Deal, which calls for reducing or eliminating the use of fossil fuels?
Yep. So air travel has actually been doing a lot of work scientifically on this to reduce fossil fuel emission. And there's a lot that we can do to make air travel much more efficient and much less, and create much fewer carbon emissions. And so we were the first union to endorse the Green New Deal. And the reason for that is because we are experiencing in our work lives as flight attendants, we are experiencing getting thrown around the cabin more with clear air turbulence that is being created by the climate changes. And that is threatening us, our safety on the job. But also we're experiencing anytime there's a climate event, there's a huge disruption. Our members many times are losing their homes. And so we have the direct impact on the people that we represent, but also our industry suddenly can't fly to a particular location, and because the infrastructure is wiped out there. And so it's not safe to land at an airport, or an airport's flooded, and that has an impact on our jobs as well. So we recognize that this is a social issue. This is an issue for our children, but this is an issue that directly affects our jobs. And the people who have tried to say that the Green New Deal would be a harm to our jobs as aviation workers are simply wrong. We need to lean in. We need to lean into the science. We need to lean into all of the efforts to reduce those carbon emissions. And there are really simple things that can be done right now. So for example, in the CARES Act, at one point during those negotiations, there was a proposal to have cash for clunkers for the airlines. And so what that would mean is the federal government would pay for those airlines to get rid of less fuel efficient airplanes and get newer airplanes that have fewer carbon emissions, use less fuel, and we're moving to biofuels as well. So there's a lot that can be done to improve this situation if we invest in that and if we all lean into that. And so that's our position. And we think that it's both morally and strategically necessary for us to lean into the Green New Deal.
Thank you. Okay, here's another question from Blair. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Bertuccini, he or she, Blair, I'm not sure, writes, they write, many unions have lost members during this economic crisis, some to the point that their existence is threatened. Including, I think this is an issue, especially for Unite Here, whose t-shirt you're wearing right now.
Yes.
What efforts should unions make to keep their laid off members organized, and I would add, and connected to the labor movement?
So I think Unite Here, I love Unite Here, by the way. I mean, what a great union. And they have been doing a lot to keep their members engaged. And right now what they're doing is engaging their members in this election. So they have actually put together a protocol where they are doing house calls and organizing around the election, and doing that and spreading the word for other unions as well. And that is so important, because as we are organizing for a better set of representatives, hopefully, to be able to truly bring us out of this crisis, you have to keep people engaged, keep people connected to the union, getting their information and having a dialogue with the union right now, so that they're not out there just listening to the noise. And so keeping those union members engaged with their union and understanding that the union is fighting is critically important to anything that we're going to do going forward. And kudos to Unite Here and what they've done on that. And we all need to be doing it.
Great. So I think we just have time for one more question. So let me bring up one that is looking into the future. I mentioned when I introduced you, and everybody here probably is aware anyway, that you're a leading candidate for the AFLCIO presidency. So our questioner just gives her first name, Merle, says, congratulations on that. And how do you envision transforming the Federation, the AFLCIO, so that it can lead a more militant class struggle winning labor movement? That's a very broad question, but since we're almost out of time, maybe you could end with something.
Okay, I'll try. To be really clear, I have not announced that I intend to run for president of the AFL-CIO. I do find it really incredible and am quite humbled by the outpouring of interest in that and support for that. I can't help but think of it because of that. And I think that what is really important is that there is a restart of the central engine there. There are central labor councils, state feds, there are incredible unions doing incredible work. And we need to do a better job of telling our story. People want to be a part of the winning team. And so the communications apparatus on that and using that position to really promote the labor movement, what we're doing, encourage people to come be a part of it. I think it can't be understated how important that is. And in addition to that, also recognizing the role as setting a tone of solidarity. We just simply cannot have anything going on out there that says, I lost mine, so you should lose yours too. I lost mine, so I'm going to fight like hell to make sure you don't lose yours too, because that's going to set the standard for my family to do better for going forward as well. And so the tone setting there, the social justice issues, the issues around immigrants' rights, around addressing racism and sexism and the tools of the boss to keep us divided are critically important, as I was talking about before. And also recognizing that we need to be a labor movement, organizing, moving forward, and understanding that we are not simply the wing of the Democratic Party, but we are actually setting the agenda for the country because we represent the vast majority of this country. We don't represent the billionaires, we represent the workers. And so I think, those are the things that I think about. I think about all that we could do with all that so many incredible union activists are already doing and the differences that they're making in people's lives. And those stories need to be told. Those victories need to be shared so that everyone wants to be a part of this.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to wrap up on, and we are out of time. So please, I know we can't applaud you in this format of Zoom, but I know that everyone present is as grateful as I am for your taking the time to join us today. And I hope the audience will tune in to future talks in this series. The next one is next week. So thank you very much for making the time to be with us today, Sara. And
thank you, Ruth, so much.
Remarks.
Appreciate it. And one last thing, using power builds power. Don't back down. Don't be afraid to use that power because power does not constrict, it expands. And that's what we're going to do going forward. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Take care, everybody.